All right. So good to be back with you guys again today. And I'm going to continue with the lecture series we interrupted last week to talk about the most recent Trump indictments. Before I get into thinking about thinking and philosophy and Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche, let me let me introduce and then digress for a moment. So if you remember, 2 weeks ago, we had started to dive a little bit deeper into Immanuel Kant's philosophy. And Kant is one of the most revolutionary philosophers of all time, certainly, I think, widely regarded as the most important modern philosopher. Doesn't mean everybody loves him, but it does mean everybody recognizes the need to engage him. And I suggested that Kant did for philosophy and really for thinking about the human mind and its capacities, its activity, its constitutive faculties, what Vermeer did for modern European painting, which is to turn the focus into the interior, to really look at the mind as active in producing the reality that we experience. And I will point out to you that contemporary cognitive science really is, in this respect at least, very Kantian. It also emphasizes that so much of what we experience, as if we were just video recorders taking it all in, as if Plato or Aristotle had basically got it right, that the intellect is the fundamental capacity of the mind. uh, Contemporary cognitive science says no, we're actively producing what we experience as reality. We are constructing, to use the Kantian vocabulary, the very categories, the concepts, the way in which we experience the world. And we'll get back into that in just a moment, and then forward to Hegel and Nietzsche to try to finish off our discussion of philosophy. But I think I would be remiss if I just pretended that nothing interesting politically had happened in the last week. And so I do want to spend just a moment talking with you about some of the things that we should be tracking and assuming that we will talk about in further lectures. And so obviously the devastation in Maui, the death count is up to 80, and I think most people assume that it's going to continue to increase as the exclamation mark on what I'm going to call the summer of extreme weather, the summer of 2023, the first summer in which I think it's been absolutely undeniable that climate change is not just a theoretical construct of scientists, but a lived experience increasingly of the majority of humanity on this planet. And there's no indication that it's going to do anything other than continue to heat until we radically change our civilization, our energy systems,
just
our
froze.
economy. And this is, I think, beginning to come home. I'm getting a
You
message.
froze for a second.
I froze for a second. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do what I can to address this. I was a little concerned when I came on that this might be the case, given a message I was getting, and it'll take me just a moment. What I'll do is quit my browser, and that means I hope that all of the bandwidth that I have on my computer now goes to Zoom. So I just did that. Am I stable at this point? Am I not freezing anymore?
Yeah, it seems okay at the moment.
Okay, let me know if there are further problems. I'll do my best to address them. This is right one aspect of the news of the last week. I think, and second aspect that we should just keep an eye on. There seems to be some evidence, and I'll put this in a couple different ways, that there is ongoing tension in Vladimir Putin's regime in Russia. That uh, the Wagner insurrection of a couple months ago has opened up these various seams of competition for power, and that it's obviously less than ideal to be in the middle of a very destructive war while your regime is also not particularly functional. And at the same time, I think we're seeing on the ground in the Ukraine the first signs that the Ukrainian more patient strategy of asymmetrical attrition, trying to wear down the ground lines of communication and supply that Russia relies on so that their troops are not resupplied, relying on the fact that the Ukrainian troops are rotating in and out of combat, but the Russian troops are not because they don't have sufficient troops to actually maintain their fortifications over a 600-mile line while also rotating the troops in and out. That there seem to be signs that the Russian troops are beginning to lose some of their ability to defend, right? And they're doing the easier work of defending. Ukraine is doing the harder work of attacking. And the Ukrainian offense is now in many places 10 miles from where it started. So there has been some advance, and it does look like the Russian troops may start to retreat more rapidly. And you put those two things together, I just think we should be ready for rapid changes, both in the war in the Ukraine and perhaps in the regime in Russia, because if the Ukrainians overwhelm the Russian troops, I can't imagine that that's going to do anything but weaken Vladimir Putin's already tenuous hold on power. We'll have to see, but I just think we shouldn't lose track of the fact that that's going on while we focus on domestic politics, or in this case, on philosophy. And then, of course, David Weiss, pictured here, right, who was originally appointed by William Barr, Donald Trump's attorney general in 2019, to investigate Hunter Biden, pictured here, has been elevated to special counsel. The plea deal that had Hunter Biden taking two misdemeanor offenses, one related to lying on an application for a gun, one related to not having paid back taxes, fell through in court last month, and now it appears the Department of Justice is going to continue its investigation, and that Hunter Biden may in fact be charged and go to court as opposed to having a plea deal. And I'll just say that this is going to echo and be amplified throughout the right-wing media system. It's going to be a major talking point for Donald Trump and other Republican candidates for the nomination for the party's president, and that it's going to probably dog Joe Biden for at least months as he begins his reelection campaign. But I think even more importantly, and I've got on the board here the ongoing disclosure of unethical gifts that have been received by members of the Supreme Court. Undisclosed gifts, I think, is the clear category, but then it also creates the impression that access to the Supreme Court, perhaps the most insulated and unaccountable power structure within the federal government, is being sold, right? And so the combined import of multiple investigations into Donald Trump, please note, right, that there have been developments just in the last week on that front. I'm not going to talk about that. An investigation into the president's son, the allegation that the president's son was peddling influence, even if it's not at this point in any way substantiated that Joe Biden did Hunter Biden any favors or American policy was in any way influenced. The idea that the president's son, the vice president's son at the time, was able to trade on his name and create the influence of access peddling gives probably sufficient credibility to a kind of plague on all of your houses narrative, right? That this is just oligarchy, that whether it's Trump or Biden or the Supreme Court or Congress, they're all bought and sold. And to the extent that cynicism, disgust, alienation becomes the dominant political mood, I do worry that that benefits Donald Trump because he is the candidate who seems to have cornered the market on saying the whole system is rigged, it's broken. Joe Biden is the candidate of making it work, right? Repairing it to the degree necessary to demonstrate that our institutions still work. You probably saw that op-ed in which Biden's word is still, Trump's word is again. Again implies that it's not working, still implies that it's still working. And I just think when we look at the bulk of the most salient and frankly salacious stories of the current domestic news cycle, this plays to Donald Trump's favor in terms of his narrative. It also puts Joe Biden in a bind. Can he campaign again on the idea that Donald Trump is a threat to American democracy when now Donald Trump is being prosecuted as a threat to American democracy without Biden appearing to be using the Department of Justice to make the case for him, right? Can he allege that Trump is unfit when his son is also being prosecuted? So again, let me pause just for a second. I don't want to spend any more time on these issues. I also want to give you a chance to discuss anything you want to discuss about them before we move on. So anybody have something they want to raise about the Hunter Biden special counsel or the ongoing investigations of Donald Trump or the overall state of play in American politics before we move on? All right, then we've made some little notes about what to come back to. Let us jump right back into the philosophy. And so I'm just going to try to refresh your memory very quickly. We've been doing our genealogy of one major way of thinking about thinking, which is the philosophical way. We've covered the ancients, the way in which Plato and Aristotle suggested that we could ultimately understand the highest truths using our intellect if we trained it in the right way in which thinkers like Descartes and Thomas Hobbes ultimately exposed a cracked and ruined foundation to that project by using the acid of doubt, the skepticism of modern philosophy to suggest no knowledge is well-founded, and the way in which Immanuel Kant attempted to respond, in particular, to the thoroughgoing, rigorous, and philosophically exact skepticism of David Hume by turning our gaze inward into the categories of the understanding. He did this with what he called his critical philosophy, his three critiques, and the idea is of erecting a critical methodology for turning reason in upon itself, but not pure reason, right? So he's constructing a critique of pure reason, with the claim being that pure reason in and of itself is empty, that what we need is reason in contact with reality, right? And that what this opens up is the idea of prior knowledge about synthetic truths, truths that add content to our knowledge of the world, that the world has to, for us, be experienced in time, and that time has a certain structure to it, such that you are always in the present, and what has been recedes in the past, what isn't yet looms in the future. And by the way, please note that there are physicists who suggest that this experience of time is probably illusory, but nevertheless, we can't experience the world but in that category. We may not be able to point to the nature of causation in the things in themselves, but nevertheless, we cannot experience the world except as a world in which causation applies, in which when I push down on my foot, I am going to step forward, because that is the precondition for me actually being able to make sense of, navigate, and be effective in the world. And so the analogy I like to this is another of Rene Magritte's paintings. This one, the famous "This is not a pipe," which is written on the painting, but not the actual title of the painting. The title of the painting is "The Treachery of Images." And I believe what Magritte is saying with this painting is, try as hard as you can to see this painting not as a pipe. You know that it's not a pipe, that it's not one dimensional, that you can't stuff it full of tobacco and incinerate and smoke that tobacco, right? Because it's one dimensional, it's canvas and paint, and it's even telling you that it's not a pipe, and yet you automatically see it as a pipe. And this gets to the activity of reason in the process of understanding. We, is the way Ludwig Wittgenstein, the great language philosopher of the 20th century, put it, is that we always see as. We never just see, we see something as, and then whatever the category is with which we understand it. You probably have had this experience. You see something and you don't know what it is, and it really puzzles you, right? When it's a nondescript or not yet categorized object. And very frequently, your eyes play tricks on you. I'm saying your eyes, that's the phrase, but really, of course, it's your brain, right? That there are, if I've got it right, over 120 million photon receptors in your eyes, right? They register how much light from what region you're seeing, and then that's translated into nerves that then go back into the visual cortex of your brain, that then tries to take that information and turn it into something you can use. It's a very active process, and it's not simply us passively receiving the information that our senses deliver to us. And it's because of the activity of the mind that we can be confident that certain aspects of our experience of the world are not just contingent and inferred, but are stably present. So Kant turns our attention back into the mind. He does this in different ways in each of his critiques. And I spent some time 2 weeks ago talking with you about the first critique, the critique of pure reason. Today, I want to speak with you a little bit about the critique of practical reason and other accompanying texts. And here Kant emphasized, as opposed to the activity of reason in giving us the categories with which we make sense of the world, so how reason augments understanding to make the world intelligible to us, now how reason guides us practically in answering the question, what are my duties to other people? What are my duties to the self? How shall I lead my life? And here Kant conceived of, again, a fundamental, he referred to it as a Copernican revolution, as opposed to Aristotle. I think this is the clearest contrast, suggesting that the telos, the end, the purpose, the highest aim of human nature is to be found by studying human nature, right? That it's there within us once you understand our capacities and their potential for perfection. Kant suggests no, we don't simply understand ourselves and in so doing get our purpose. We have to legislate for ourselves. We have to make our own law. And Kant, the one of the influential books about Kant is called The Invention of Autonomy, where, right, that term autonomos literally means self law or self-made norm, that we have to make our laws for ourselves. But then Kant added, and then I think this is incredibly important, that the way in which reason makes laws for the self is determinate, so that there are universal laws of reason that every human being, if they reflect on the nature of law and the nature of reason, will come to understand that they are under the same obligation. So despite the fact that we make our law, we don't find it out there in the world, we are nevertheless under certain universal requirements of reason. There is an objective morality that we construct, but we all construct in the same way. And the way in which Kant referred to the fundamental rules or laws of reason in his most important, I think people regard it as the most important work, I certainly do, of his moral philosophy, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, is as categorical imperatives, right? These are imperatives that reason imposes upon us and for which there is no alternative. And there are multiple formulations. Kant ultimately maintained that each of these formulations was identical. They're different ways of understanding different aspects of the law that are perhaps more useful in certain circumstances than other formulations, but ultimately they are all equivalent. The first formulation: act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And here the idea is universalization or generalization. When you act, ask yourself, can I envision a world in which everybody acts in the way that I am about to act? If so, if that's a good world, if that's a world that works, then I pass the test of universalization. Everybody could do what I'm doing and the world would be just fine. If, on the other hand, I say to myself, boy, if everybody did what I'm thinking of doing right now, the world would fall apart or it'd be a much worse place, then you're treating yourself as exceptional. You're saying to yourself, I hope to get away with this, but I hope nobody else does this, right? And that is, on Kant's account, incompatible with the idea of giving yourself a law. A law should be universally applicable to everyone. Second formula of humanity as an end in itself. And so the first one helps us to figure out what to do. The second one helps us to figure out how to treat other people. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end, never only as a means. And so we are allowed to ask other people to assist us. When you check out at the grocery theater, I'm sorry, at the grocery store, thinking going into the movie theater, you are allowed to obviously treat the person who's checking you out as someone who you need to take your money so you can get your groceries and get home, right? But having said that, if you treat them exclusively as a means to your end, if you don't treat them with the respect due to someone who, in addition to being useful or instrumental to you, has their own life, has their own purposes, has their own understanding, has their own reason, and therefore makes their own meaning and ends for themselves, then you're failing to respect their humanity. And then you are denying, neglecting their capacity to reason for themselves. And now you're back to violating the first law, right? You're not actually doing something you would universalize. Third formula of autonomy, act so that your will, could regard itself as giving a universal law through its maxims. And here, I think the emphasis changes. It's quite similar to the universal law formulation, except now you are emphasizing your autonomy, your capacity to make your own laws. And here, Kant suggests that there's an experience of freedom that we are intuitively aware of and that reflects our capacity for autonomy. One of the examples that Kant gives is the example of entering a burning building to save an innocent person who you have no acquaintance with, right? And his claim is that, in a sense, every fiber in your being uh, resists the idea of putting your life at risk for someone who you don't even know. And let's assume that this is in a remote location. You're not going to get any credit for it, and yet you do it, right? You overcome your instinct, you overcome that tendency in your nature to want to preserve yourself in order to do the right thing or the good thing. And that reveals to us that we have the capacity to make rules for ourselves. When you drop a rock, it doesn't think, should I fall or not? It obeys the dumb rules of physics, dumb in the sense that they are indifferent to intention or to autonomy, right? But when you and I decide what we can do, we have that capacity to actually determine the course of our action. Never lose track of that. Regard yourself, when you choose what to do, as autonomous and therefore as lawmaking. And by the way, in a world in which most people do the right thing for the right reason, we serve as models for each other. It makes it more likely that everyone, or most of us, will actually live in what Kant calls a kingdom of ends in his final formula. Act so that your will can regard itself as making a universal law for a kingdom of ends. That is to say, a kingdom in which every person recognizes themselves as an end in themselves, as having intrinsic autonomy, meaning, equality, and dignity, and also recognizes every other person in that regard as well. And I'll just point out to you very quickly, there's a deep moral egalitarianism to Kant's philosophy, because we each have reason, because reason is sufficient to make us autonomous and moral and an end in ourselves. Each of us deserves equal treatment. And so I think now we're seeing the way in which Kant's theory perhaps gives secure foundations to, I think, what many of us regard to be the central hallmark of moral modernity, and that is egalitarianism, or the idea that every individual has equal standing. I'm going to conclude by reading a passage from Kant's Critique of Practical Reason that is actually the plaque that is placed to mark Kant's grave, has this on it as well. So this is his epigraph. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect upon them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. I do not seek or conjecture either of them as if they were veiled obscurities beyond the horizon of my vision. I see them before me and connect immediately with the consciousness of my existence. The first starts at the place, right, the starry heavens above, that I occupy in the external world of the senses, and extends the connection in which I stand into the limitless magnitude of worlds upon worlds, systems upon systems, as well as into the boundless times of their periodic motion, the beginning and continuation. And so I hope you see what Kant is saying there, right? That when I look at, and I think you got to imagine yourself, we're in the middle of the meteor showers right now, in a dark place, right, without electrical light pollution, looking up at the heavens on a clear night without much moon, and seeing vast galaxies of stars above you, and the experience of being incredibly minute and insignificant from the point of view of the universe, that tends to inspire in one. I'm just a tiny dot on a tiny planet in this firmament containing countless planets, worlds, stars. How insignificant am I? The second, going to the quote again, begins with my invisible self, my interior, right? Not my physical manifestation, my personality, and displays to me a world that has true infinity, but which can only be detected through the understanding, and with which I know myself to be in, not as in the first case, merely contingent, but universal and necessary connection, right? There's no necessity that there would be life on Earth or that we would be here to witness it. But because I am alive and equipped with reason, I know myself to have autonomy and morality within me. The first perspective of a countless multitude of worlds, as it were, annihilates my importance as an animal creature. The second, on the contrary, infinitely elevates my worth as an intelligence through my personality, in which the moral law reveals to me a life independent from animality and even the entire world of the senses, at least so far as they may be judged from the purposive determination of my existence through this law. So I hope you're getting this. Let me come out for a moment. Right, Kant is saying to himself, and to us, right, the strategy of Plato, Aristotle, Catholic theology, right, that says look out into the world and look for meaning, purpose, law, rules, morality there, ultimately leads us to the conclusion that we are animals and annihilates our significance. If you instead look inside, not seeking your meaning out there in the world, but creating for yourself your law that's going to govern you, your purposes, your meanings, you will find in yourself a capacity that restores your significance in the universe, because so far as we know, we are the only creatures with reason and capable of using reason in a legislative way to make ourselves better people and to make our world a better world. And that is as inspiring, Kant suggests, as is the firmament of the universe, right? And so I just want you to see that Kant is suggesting absolutely that when we claim to know the world, what we really have the only thing we can be confident of is what we add to it, not what we understand of it. But the fact that our reason has that capacity to shape the world and to shape us is sufficient to regard us as ends in ourselves and to inspire us about ourselves. So that's the turn to the interior that Kant brings about. We've now, I hope, got a firm grip on it. Any questions or thoughts before we meet our friend George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel? Yeah, Joan, are you saying something to me? No, okay, all right. I can see your lips moving, but you're talking to somebody else. That's fine. You're still muted, but okay. Nobody else right now? I'm going to keep going, and you let me know whenever you have a question or a comment, please. So, as I say, we're now on our way to Hegel. Come on, there we go. And I'm going to be relatively brief in talking about Hegel and Nietzsche. I do think, at least for the purposes of what I'm trying to do with you today, we can get a simpler understanding of them. And so Hegel is immediate, uh, uh, it stands immediately in Kant's wake. He comes directly after Kant, and he is writing in a philosophical moment that Kant absolutely dominates, and yet Hegel, right? You can see his years. He straddles the 18th and 19th century. He's obviously German. He becomes, in his time, the leading philosopher in Germany. He constructs an entire philosophical system that he argues is an integrated system. You have to read all of it. I'm not going to try to introduce you to the Hegelian logic or the Hegelian philosophy of history, other than to give you just a little taste. But Hegel is part of, and you can think of him as perhaps akin to Beethoven or Goethe or Schelling in this regard, the romantic reaction to scientific and rationalistic modernity, who wants to say there's more to it than reason. There's more to it than autonomy, and we have to broaden our perspective about everything that makes us human. And in particular, when it comes to Kant's moral philosophy, Hegel is ambivalent. On the one hand, he says Kant is absolutely right, that we are all equipped with a faculty, reason, that makes us potentially autonomous, potentially capable of leading our own lives. But there's several problems with the way in which Kant actually thinks about or formulates his conception of autonomy. One of them is that it's completely ahistorical. And Hegel adds, look, there's a reason that in the history of moral philosophy, Kant is really, as the book I was referring to, the inventor of autonomy, the first person to really make this the central moral attribute of humanity. And that's because his culture equips him to think this way, that this is, in a sense, the first time in human history that our civilizations have treated us as autonomous. And Hegel famously says that philosophy is just its time in history reflected in ideas. Philosophy doesn't get at the mind as such, but the mind as it is shaped by the cultural resources available to it at a particular historical moment in a particular society. And if that is correct, Hegel adds, then when I turn philosophy back into myself, what I'm seeing is not my mind per se, not the right core aspects of cognition and reason, but my mind as it's shaped by the categories and concepts and language that my society has given me for self-expression and self-constitution. And so to put this somewhat technically, Hegel accuses Kant of positivism, not recognizing that what he is a product of his historical moment and trying to jump out of his historical moment, and solipsism, not recognizing that he is always shaped by his culture, but thinking he somehow transcends his culture. So when Hegel redirects the subject and method of philosophy into an examination of the individual as socially constructed or constituted, he also redirects philosophical attention to social historical processes. How did German culture of the late 18th century come to value autonomy? Well, Hegel would say the Protestant Revolution and then the French Revolution had an awful lot to do with that. And you don't have Kant unless you have Protestantism and Napoleon, right? And so you've got to pay attention to the way in which history shapes culture, but not from the perspective of a historian. A historian goes episode by episode, moment by moment, everything looks equally significant. From the perspective of philosophy, what is this historical moment contributing to more adequate cultural resources for understanding the self, freedom, society, culture? And from that vantage point, not everything is historically important, but certainly the Reformation and Napoleon, Hegel thinks, bear not just historical, but philosophical attention because they represent new ideas that actually allow us to better understand ourselves. So the process of history and the philosophically relevant elements of history have to be understood, Hegel suggests, from the inside. We have to actually get inside the minds of Luther and Calvin and Napoleon and the people who are influenced by their ideas in order to fully understand why their ideas have power and have influence. And so the project of reconstructing history philosophically is also an interpretive project. Get inside the head of the persons who have actually been influenced by those ideas. And so the effort to reconstruct the evolution of consciousness from within is the subject matter of two of Hegel's most influential works, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which he publishes in 1807 and leads to him becoming the most important philosopher in Germany, and then The Philosophy of Right, which is his work of political philosophy and his effort to reconstruct the evolution of moral consciousness. And I'll just point out that if you were to take Hegel's ideas seriously, which I strongly suggest we do, right, one question would be, well, okay, I'm always socially constituted. I'm not just a human being. I'm a 21st century American human being, and the way I think myself is shaped by the culture of my society. Does that mean that we're just infinitely malleable and always going to be different depending upon which historical moment we're in? And here Hegel says no. And this is his doctrine of the end of history, where the end is understood in that Aristotelian way, the telos, the purpose, that history is moving closer and closer to giving us better and better resources to understand and articulate our humanity and our identities, and that on Hegel's account, we are quite close to the end of history in the early 19th century. I'm going to stop there and just notice, right, that Hegel is asking us to, in a sense, situate Kant, and to say not that Kant is wrong, but that Kant misinterprets what he's doing as reason turning itself in upon itself, when it's actually 18th century German elite reason turning itself in upon 18th century German elite reason. And that's a project that needs to be understood historically and socially as well as individually. All right, so we get to the last of the great German philosophers of this period. I'm sorry I didn't put Friedrich Nietzsche's years on the board there. Let me see very quickly if I can get them for you. But Nietzsche is a 19th century philosopher. He's born, let me see, in 1844. He dies in 1900. So he's mainly from the second half of the 19th century. And if you know a little bit about Nietzsche, you probably know that his last 15 years of life, he had descended into insanity. He was non-communicative. So really, the productive period of Nietzsche's life goes from the 1850s into the 1870s. And I'm just going to try to introduce you to a few ideas of Nietzsche's, his reaction against Hegel and Kant, and really his effort to upend the whole philosophical tradition going all the way back to Plato. And so Nietzsche starts with this idea that ultimately becomes the title of a collection of writings that were not published by him when he still had his wits and faculties about him, but were published by his sister, who became the literary executor of his estate, The Will to Power, right? And his claim is that will and power are actually the most fundamental attributes of humanity. That knowledge is not experience plus reason, as Kant had suggested, or experience and reason as shaped by culture and history, as Hegel had suggested. Knowledge is a fairly violent imposition on a disorderly and incomprehensible world in which the will takes recalcitrant material and does with it what it needs to do in order for us to be able to make sense of and survive in this world. So I think I've got a glass in my hand, right? And what seems to be true is that I can tilt that up to my lips and get a little drink of liquid out of it. But what Nietzsche suggests is I have imposed that category on this object in the world, that I have no idea what is actually out there. And therefore, the fundamental capacity relevant to understanding us is our will and our use of power via will. So this is an ontology, as I'm saying, a theory of what there is. The fundamental thing there is in the world is our power to make the world. Knowledge and rationality on this view are not opposed to will and power. And here we can think about the old adage, speaking truth to power. Nietzsche does not believe that truth is independent of power, but instead that knowledge and power are always inextricably connected to each other. There would be no truth without power, without our imposition of form on the world. Will to power is the fundamental way in which we produce knowledge, but then we try to forget that. We delude ourselves. We cover that over. And part of the reason we do that is it gives us more power. I'm not actively imposing on the world. I'm just understanding the world. There's no choice. You have to understand the world the way the world is. Never mind the previous operation of creating a world that's ordered in that way. And also, Nietzsche is suggesting that we impose order on ourselves, and that forgetting that we have imposed that order on ourselves make our identities more stable. So if knowledge is obtained through the violent imposition of order on the intrinsically disorderly, um, then we are perpetually creating our identities by denying the plural forces within us. And Nietzsche was familiar with Walt Whitman. I am large, I contain multitudes, and with ways in which Whitman's ideas influenced Emerson and Thoreau, and then Nietzsche. His idea that perhaps we should be more attuned to the disorder in the self, that the effort to make reason legislative for the self, to make ourselves autonomous, was ultimately costly and potentially destructive. And this is where Nietzsche actually channels some of the romantic ideas about being more attuned to emotion, more attuned to the experience of transcendence in the world, more attuned to violence and will as well. And so knowledge requires forgetting. Nietzsche said famously on several occasions, forgetting the imposition of order on self and the world, and that the imposing of order on self and the world can be at once constructive or destructive. And here we begin to get into Nietzsche's more cultural and political critique of European modernity. He suggests that we have become too egalitarian, too democratic, too disciplined, too regulated by reason, and that ultimately this whole culture is devouring itself, that we are becoming increasingly, as he put it, nihilistic, increasingly incapable of producing convincing sources of meaning that make life worth living. And Nietzsche really worried that Judeo-Christian culture was in the process of exhausting itself, and he saw his work as stating that with great clarity in order to prepare the way for a post-Judeo-Christian culture, what has come to be called a post-modern culture, right? That modernity is, Hegel was right, grounded in, let's say for sake of simplicity, Protestantism and Napoleon, the French Revolution and the religious revolution that gave us new ways of thinking and new ways of living. And Nietzsche is suggesting it's run its course and it's no longer productive. And we need, one way he put it, is new prophets to renew us, new people who could create new cultural ideas as new sources of meaning, who would have the strength and the power and the will to impose new ideas. And the idea that Nietzsche then is defending is that, in a sense, as he claims, the entire philosophical tradition, going back to Plato, culminates in European modernity. That tradition has exhausted itself. We need an entirely new tradition. And yet Nietzsche doesn't give us that tradition. He sees his work as clearing the grounds for somebody else to come along and do this. So I think I should stop there and again see if you have questions or thoughts. Flossie, please go ahead. Remember to unmute yourself, please.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
I have just torn myself away from my talking book, which took me through the whole July.
Oh, we lost her.
Wait a sec, Flossie. Okay, go ahead. Now you're talking. Now you got to unmute again. You got to hold that space bar down.
I have just finished reading the July 10 New Yorker magazine, in which there is a very interesting, penetrating discussion of Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And I think what you have in that book, through fiction, the change that is occurring, that moving from a kind of fighting against what is established, the acceptance of something that is totally authoritarian, and how and why that comes about. It's fascinating, and I've always argued that in fiction there is so much truth.
So Flossie, I haven't read that article yet. I'm smiling to myself because my son just read the Dostoevsky novel. And so I emailed him the article and said, this might be interesting. And if he, of course, read it right away and said, wow, what a great article. And so now it's on my to read list, but I haven't got there yet. So thank you for calling that to our attention. And by the way, Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, although they end in very different places, are attracted by a lot of similar ideas, in particular the idea of nihilism as a looming threat in modern society is common to both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. Anybody else with a thought or a comment or something you've been reading that resonates with what we're talking about here today? I've stumped you all with too much German philosophy. Well, let me just conclude very briefly, and I'm going to come back next week, assuming that we continue in this vein, and just try to wrap things up, give us a probably not terribly neat little bundle of ideas that we take away from philosophy. And then I'm going to transition into psychology. And I'm going to move very quickly into 21st century psychology. And so psychology inflected by brain science. And so remember the jumping off place, right? Which is, we're in a world of artificial intelligence now. It happened very quickly, but it does appear that artificial intelligence is doing many of the things that we thought until quite recently only human intelligence could do, and doing them as well or better than we do them, right? And that led me to raise the question, what is it we're doing when we're thinking, and what is it doing that machines are doing when they're thinking, right? So thinking about thinking, human thinking and machine thinking, and we're still figuring out what it is we do when we think. Philosophy gives us one perspective, and it is, I want to say, an introspective, perhaps even a naive perspective, in the sense that we have access to what we're doing. And psychology, especially the psychology I want to introduce to you, fundamentally challenges that idea and suggests instead that most of what makes us think what we think is unconscious and automatic, and get ready for it, maybe even algorithmic, which is to say, maybe we are more like machines than we realize, that our intuitions, which we think of as the outcome of our thought processes, are actually produced by unconscious inferential systems in our minds. And so I'll leave you just with a quick example. You go to cross the street, you take a look to your left, you take a look to your right, all clear, safe to cross, right? And you see that car 2/3 of the way down the block, and you're not worried about it, right? Why is that? Is it because you've calculated how fast that car is moving, what the distance is between you and that car, how quickly you can walk, and you recognize I'm going to be across the street in 10 seconds and that car won't be here for 20 seconds, right? Or is it just because you have a hunch, you have an intuition, you have basically a capacity to do that calculation without even thinking about it, right? And it's clearly the latter, right? If you took the time to calculate what's the speed of that car, how far is it from me, how long is it going to take me to get across the street, of course the car would be gone and several other cars while you were sitting there trying to do that calculation. That's not the way our minds work. So much of what we do with our minds depends on unconscious calculation, inference, reasoning, and that's what we need to start unearthing, in addition to our capacity for autonomy or the categories we bring to our understanding. So that's where we'll go together next week. Everybody be well, take care, and I look forward to seeing you again next Saturday. Thanks. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.